So when we left last time, JFK had been assassinated and LBJ is coming into power. So, question for today, how did Johnson expand on or counter the ideas that Kennedy established in the early 1960s? The key to keep in mind is JFK was popular, again, very well known. It was a very competitive election with Nixon, but people generally liked him, and now someone who was voted on technically as the vice president, right, but is not the president, has now got to take over for this person who has been killed. And so there is a very clear desire by the American public for LBJ to do the stuff that Kennedy would have done and continue in that legacy. So we saw this picture before. This is when he is sworn in on Air Force One, and he does try to carry out this legacy of Kennedy, the stuff that he wanted, both domestically and stand firm against communism when it comes to foreign policy. So he does have a desire to actually do that. For the third time here, you're seeing public support for this. This is what people want from LBJ. They want him to do the stuff or continue the stuff that JFK would have done. That's the person they voted for. When it came to the 1964 election, LBJ kind of has to run on his own stuff because, well, Kennedy's term is over. And he's running against Barry Goldwater. And I want to shout out this, I guess you could say, campaign poster. Goldwater, A-U-H-O. I mean, that's kind of clever. Yeah, that's a good one. So LBJ is going to campaign on a promise to end poverty and create what he calls a great society. And spoiler alert, he's going to win. And we are going to look at this great society that LBJ wants to create. Goldwater is a staunch conservative, so not pushing for that progressive type stuff that LBJ is pushing for. Let's keep this in the back of our minds, this kind of showdown between this progressivism and conservatism and the growing support for kind of what we now think of as modern day conservatism, because we are going to see that kind of start coming into more focus and more power as we get further through this unit. So LBJ wins, and his domestic plan is the Great Society. And so the question is, was that program a success? These are some of the key pieces of legislation, and they tie into some of the stuff we saw with the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Act, ending segregation and racial discrimination, but doesn't have voting in there. There's an Economic Opportunity Act, which is an economic package focused on ending poverty. Head Start, which is still around, preschool program for underprivileged children, and Volunteers in Service to America, which is kind of like a domestic Peace Corps. So if you're looking at these policies, right, these are more progressive. They're targeting groups of people who are being held down, suppressed, repressed, however you want to frame it, in America at that time. Also, one of the things that may be maybe the biggest legacy of the Great Society for you, I know it is for my daughter, is going to be PBS and Sesame Street. So in 69 and 68, respectively, Sesame Street is going to be created. And I'm going to go a little bit nerdy here on this because it kind of lines up with education. So the goal of Sesame Street was, all right, kids are going to come into, let's say, kindergarten, right? And they need to start being able to get into the process of learning how to read. And so they need to be able to recognize words. And one of the core things of reading is you need to be exposed to a lot of words. That's why when you ever have kids, read to them a lot. Words are important. And one of the things they were finding is there was a gap between typically rich families and then poorer families in the word recognition for those students. And so they wanted to try and bridge that gap and cut into that divide. And so they're like, all right, we know that maybe these poor families, their parents have to work all the time, so they just can't read to them. So maybe they're coming home and they're sitting in front of a TV. So let's do a children's program that's going to help boost word recognition. Sesame Street. And you can see that the goal was to boost speech acquisition, how many words children knew, and close that gap. What ended up happening, though, was richer families also acknowledged that Sesame Street was a good thing. And so if this was the gap before, after Sesame Street, you just go like this. So everyone learns more, but you still have that gap that is present. Shout out to Elmo. That's my daughter's favorite person on Sesame Street. Puppet, I guess. He's a person to her. Here are some successes of the Great Society, and we'll look at some things that National Endowment for Arts and Humanities, using public money to fund arts and artists and galleries. Elementary and Secondary Education Act, providing major funding for public schools. The Voting Rights Act, which again we talked about in the civil rights part, that's very significant. I want you to keep this in mind because when I'm recording this, there was a lot of conversation around the stimulus package that just passed, and then other attempts by the Biden presidency, and a lot of, I will say historians, right? But people in the moment are saying, hey, this is stuff that's hearkening back to that great society, trying to target lots of different categories of things and try and advance those forward. The child tax credit that's been around for a few years has been expanded, but it's going to be paid out monthly this year. And will that stay around permanently? That's a way to target poverty, and that was something that LBJ said. And so are we seeing any connections or similarities between these two people? I will point out LBJ is going to be very like a well-known senator before he ultimately becomes president, and Joe Biden did the same thing, and they were both vice president before, so... However, LBJ's legacy is not really about the Great Society. It's primarily about the much bigger problem that he oversaw, and that's Vietnam. Background on Vietnam. How do we get here? So, since 1887, France had actually been controlling Vietnam, and it was a French colony. There's actually this dynamic coming out of World War I where the Vietnamese are like, they literally are at the Treaty of Versailles, and they're trying to meet with Woodrow Wilson to be like, please help us. Self-determination, right? That's the thing you focused on. We want to be our own country. We don't want to be held down by the French. Self-determination. And no, it doesn't happen. So in 45, the communist leader, Ho Chi Minh, there's a name to remember, is going to begin a war of independence to try and take Vietnam over from the French colonizers. Now, this is where Vietnam can be complicated, and Vietnam is just complicated in general, but it really starts off complicated as well. And this is one of the classic struggles that America has during the time of the Cold War, and it's when our ideals don't align with our strategic best interests. So our ideals as America are things like self-determination. We didn't support them in World War I because we needed to make sure France was on our side with the peace, and we had to give up some other things, so it didn't work strategically. When there is now a rebellion and you go, oh, well, that would make sense for us to want to, you know, we're the group of colonists who rebelled and overthrew our country that was colonizing us, and then we kind of helped the Pacific and the Guam and Philippines and Cuba, well, kind of not. Well, okay, we'll set that one aside. But now that we're in this element of the Cold War, Truman and Eisenhower are concerned about the spread of communism in Asia. This is something called the domino theory. And the domino theory is once these little pieces fall, that'll lead to bigger and bigger and bigger things falling in the future. And so the concern is don't even let the small things go. We can't budge on the little things because those little things are going to lead to much bigger and more significant things. So we send aid to France and we support them during this time. So Vietnam will win their independence in 1954, but it becomes divided along the 17th parallel. So you have North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam is going to be communist, and then South Vietnam is going to be Western-backed and is going to be more capitalist. Ho Chi Minh again, there you go. He's going to take control of North Vietnam. Dinh Diem is going to be in charge of South Vietnam. There is an entire book and books focusing on all of the reign of these French-backed Vietnamese people leading the South, and there's a lot of stuff between Catholicism and Buddhism, and there's so many different tensions here. And for our sake and time, I will say the following. Diem was like really corrupt, just like really corrupt. And there was a lot of corruption in these people in power, and they were backed by the French, and there was a big push on French Catholicism dominating society. And so you really are going to see this like peasantry, regular, everyday folks who are Vietnamese tend to be more Buddhist, looking at a society that is set up around French people being in power or French-backed Vietnamese people in power, and there's corruption up there. And so there is this kind of antagonism between those two levels. And this is, again, in South Vietnam. All right, let's define some terms here. So the first one is the Viet Minh. These are going to be Ho Chi Minh communist supporters who are in the north. So already communist, Viet Minh. Then you have people in South Vietnam who are communists and would like to turn South Vietnam into Vietnam and be communist, and those are called Viet Cong. they form around this opposition to Diem, and they of course want to unify Vietnam. So Viet Minh in the north, Viet Cong in the south, but technically all part of the same thing. In 63, JFK is going to okay the assassination of Diem. And again, it says here, corrupt. So we're at play here knowing, well, we were backing him before. It's not really going where we want. Let's get rid of him and kind of replace him with someone else that might be better. Now, of course, JFK is going to be assassinated. Diem is going to be taken out. And then you have this kind of chaos in South Vietnam. And now LBJ is in office, and it's complicated. In 64, there is going to be an attack. And I put this in quotes for a reason. So we have, this is in the Gulf of Tonkin. We have the USS Maddox, and it's, traveling around. We got an eye on the area. We had been providing military advisors into Vietnam for a while now, South Vietnam. And so our presence there isn't unique or that abnormal. But of course, Northern Vietnamese people don't want America poking around. And there is going to be an attack on this Maddox. There is a claim of torpedoing of this. Now, there has been some previous some interpretation since then that it was actually just radar malfunctioning. There wasn't actually, but this Gulf of Tonkin incident, regardless of whether or not it truly happened, is going to be the catalyst for American intervention in Vietnam. And Congress responds with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which basically says LBJ has a whole bunch of powers that he can use to defend Vietnam at any cost. And we need to keep an eye on this. There's a lot of conversation today around how much power the president should have in fighting things versus Congress declaring war and determining what happens. And here in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the power is given to the president. It's LBJ's job to manage this. Congress is kind of like, we don't want to deal with it. And that sets a very powerful precedent. In 65, we'll start sending ground troops into Vietnam. And that's going to start to ramp up and become a big problem later. Now, our goal in Vietnam is to defeat the Viet Cong, those people in the South, right? And secure democracy in South Vietnam. We're just trying to contain. We're not trying to roll back and get rid of North Vietnam as well. We're just focusing on containment, so let's get rid of those Viet Cong. Essentially, the war in Vietnam is a war against insurgency. You have people who are Vietnamese living in the area, farmers, who during the day farm, and then at night they go get weapons, and then they go and lay ambushes on American forces. There isn't a clear delineation of these are the bad guys, these are the good guys, because they're hiding. And so a lot of parallels between Vietnam and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan can come up. In particular, the wars. The struggle for dominant forces like the American army in both of those situations is going to be the fact that what are you fighting? Like, it's not super tangible. They're not going to come meet you on a battlefield. You can't just lay bombing campaigns, although we'll try. It's tough because they're like doing what we did, guerrilla warfare, right? A little strike, a little ambush, and then go run off and then join back with the village and pretend like you didn't do it. So we will try bombing campaigns. This is known as Operation Rolling Thunder. And there's a couple names in here, Agent Orange and Napalm. You're probably more familiar with Napalm if you've played any of the more modern Call of Duty games, but napalm is going to be an explosive that you can drop that can kind of spread fire, and then Agent Orange is going to work to destroy vegetation to try and make it harder for the enemy to hide in the jungles of Vietnam. Now, I will point out, we have seen a large number of Vietnam veterans who have become sick, and that's been tied to Agent Orange. So not only was it devastating to kind of the environment and the people there, but then also our own people, years, decades down the line. As America is doing this, people in South Vietnam are like, wait, stop? And as they don't like what's happening, they become more and more likely to become sympathetic to the Viet Cong or North Vietnam eventually. And so America is trying to stop people from wanting this independence, and we're doing it by using force, but that's making more people want to join it, and so it kind of is going to be really difficult to try and win for us. Here are some very famous photos of this situation in Vietnam. Obviously, it should be mentioned that regular everyday civilians are roped up into this. They have no choice on being involved or not. And that's going to be obviously a problem for them. You see this even in modern times as we talk about drone strikes that America does in places like the Middle East, and whether or not there are civilian casualties or children casualties and things like that. This notion is still happening today, just like it did back in Vietnam. And keep an eye on that. The powerful image of America attacking children, because we're going to see in the protest movement that comes up around this, there is going to be that push of, hey, you're baby killers. And we're going to see this be a big attack lobbed against like American soldiers who come back home. Almost all, well, not almost all, but a ton of them are drafted and didn't actually want to be there and being labeled as baby killers. So you can see here the troop escalation, and we're going to see the highest point in 68. 68 is going to be a crazy year. You think 2020 was bad, 68 would like to have a word with you. And we'll get to that as we hit several different parts of not only Vietnam, but this whole unit. And there'll be about 500,000 American soldiers deploying to Vietnam. So that's kind of the peak that we see. We do bombing runs on supply lines going into the north along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. If you look at that picture, you can see Ho Chi Minh is working to support the Viet Cong by traveling through Cambodia and Laos, and then kind of jumping into the south and then dropping supplies or, you know, even some attacks in some cases along there to help support the Viet Cong. The general American tactic as soldiers is you send them out on what become known as search and destroy missions. You are going to see some counterinsurgency type things, but not nearly in the numbers that you'll see the search and destroy. If you watch generally any Vietnam movie, they're going to have some scene about this. And it's basically where your job is to go out and search and destroy things that you find that are bad. And Viet Cong lay ambushes, booby traps, all sorts of things to make that more complicated. But when you go outside the wire, you know there's a pretty good chance something bad could happen. And we'll talk more about this in live, but there is a lot of complexity around this, especially for soldiers who are incredibly put on edge and who know. And there's actually a movie, a documentary, I should say, called Restrepo, and last I saw it was on Netflix. But it's about this forward point for American soldiers in Afghanistan. And there is one part in particular where these soldiers are going into a village, and they're commenting on the fact that they know that people in that village come out at night and shoot at them and then go back into that village. They know that happens, but they don't have definitive proof, and they don't know which individuals, but they know that happens. And there is that animosity and that fear of someone is coming to attack me, but they're not labeling it and they're not putting a uniform on, but I know they're over there. And you're going to see that crescendo in Vietnam into some truly horrific acts of violence against really civilians. The My Lai massacre is going to be one of the more significant and well-known, and that, of course, is going to be something that fosters protest against the Vietnam War at home. Over time, the war becomes unpopular, and we're going to see really this pushback, especially over things like the draft, as people really do not support this war over time. And it truly does become, eventually, everyone kind of is like, we need to move on. In 68, again, there's that year, there's going to be the Tet Offensive. So around this holiday celebration that Vietnam would have, we're like, oh, no one's going to attack. And then there's this massive assault across Vietnam. And it really knocks America back. Now, America then actually pushes even further and actually takes back more holdings than they had before Tet, after Tet. But that's not how the media covers it, because that takes a little bit of time. What gets covered is, oh my God, America was surprised. Look at how horrific this is. We are losing. And I do want to emphasize, and we'll see this pop up again with something called the credibility gap. But the credibility gap was how president after president and advisor after advisor came in front of the American people and was like, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. And yet it looked like we weren't. And so people started to distrust the government. We take distrust of the government as accepted. Oh yeah, it makes sense. People don't trust the government. People had a lot of trust in the government before this. This in the 60s and onward is really going to tear down, think Watergate, the faith that people had in their government. So let's look at protest here. How did anti-war protests influence the war in Vietnam? And then why would 1968 be considered a turning point? So there are a few different stages of protest. And so we're going to kind of tackle them piece by piece. So this first one's about 64 to 65. We're just getting to starting maybe sending in some actual ground troops, and we're starting to ramp up our sending in of advisors. So the groups that are involved in anti-war protesting at this point are left-wing peace activists and college students focused on injustice. Think the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. These are people you would expect to lead a protest, right? More fringy elements and definitely more on the extreme side of the political scale. Their goals are to give activists knowledge about Vietnam and get other followers, and then to normalize opposition. And this is something that I think you really can see if we want to compare, let's just say, the Black Lives Matter movement of like 2014 to the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020. I don't know how much of you were remembering the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014, but it did not have nearly the mass acceptance that the 2020 Black Lives Matter did. And part of that is because you laid down this time. There is already some expectation in people's mind that this is a movement. And then over time, you can add more followers and normalize opposition. It's okay to be opposed to this. The second stage is going to be 66 to 68. The groups are a unification of various strands of anti-war opposition, but particularly behind draft resistance. There is going to be a ton of people upset about the draft because you're drafting overwhelmingly young men who probably didn't have much income, or their families didn't have much income, and they're going to fight a war for arguably nebulously connected American reasons, and they're dying. And that is something that people have a lot of, opposition to. And so this becomes one of the popular sticking points for opposition to the war. Like, sure, America should containment, whatever, but let's not do that draft, but I don't think these soldiers or these boys should be the ones fighting that war. So the goals here: build a mass movement, not just normalize opposition, but get a mass movement. And two, convert the movement into a political force. And this is something that a lot of movements struggle with. How do you get opposition and then people and that animosity? And we need to change stuff and turn that into actually functioning political change, because we're talking about different segments of the population. The people in charge of politics are not the people part of grassroots movements. That's just not how our structure of government is. And this is going to fail. And we'll talk about Nixon later and his specific actions in Vietnam. But ultimately, you're not going to see political change in 66 and 68 over this issue. And there's going to be a growing split between protest and resistance. Where's that line in between just protesting something and then straight up trying to resist it? Now, the draft, as I mentioned, is, you can see here, resist the draft, don't register. A difference between protesting, being like, I don't like the draft, and straight up don't register for the draft or flee from the draft, or draft dodgers. So the average soldier is around 18 years old. They're poor and they have a high school diploma or less. Again, that concept of a rich man's war, a poor man's fight. The draft was a lottery system based on your birthday. And there's actually a website you can go to see if you would have been drafted in Vietnam. Only if you're a guy though. Girls, you would not have been drafted. So you don't have to go find it. There are people called draft dodgers. These are people avoiding the draft, so they might burn their draft cards, or some defer the process by enrolling in college or pretending to have illnesses. Shout out to some notable politicians. Stage 3, 69 to 71, May of 71. These are when your groups start to include veterans and anti-war GIs. Vietnam Veterans Against the War would be kind of a collective of that group. And there's an emphasis on Marxism, which is going to get rid of the Students for Democratic Society, right? Because that's Democratic Society, not Marxism. But you're finally seeing actual veterans being involved in this protest about the war. Hey, I've been there. I saw this. This wasn't worth it, etc., etc. Their goals are to increase radicalization and switch from "we're killing our own" to "this war is wrong, victory to the Viet Cong." So instead of just "we're killing our own boys by sending them over there," it's "this war is unjust, we shouldn't do it. I actually want Viet Cong to win." And I want you to think about this divide. People who are very much pro-America, and then those people are hearing Americans say, "I want the other side to win this war." That's going to be some tension in society in the 60s, of course, going into the 70s as well. It may not surprise you that the largest numbers of people supporting this movement are African Americans, Hispanics, and high school dropouts, the people most targeted by the draft. There is a protest at Kent State in 1970. This is why you see that split in May, and the National Guard actually fires upon and kills students protesting in this. And the final stage of protest is going to be the Pentagon Papers up to 75. And so the Pentagon Papers are going to reveal that the politicians were kind of lying to you. They knew the whole time we weren't going to be able to win this war. And yet they continued to lie about body count and things like that. And these groups are going to become more widespread. You'll have the Indochina Peace Campaign, medical aid for Indochina, and you'll start to see political changes. The goal is to drop militancy and adopt inclusive tactics to build a political force against Vietnamization, which would be getting Vietnamese people back in charge of that. Now, technically, this isn't the end of Vietnam. We still have Nixon to go, and we still need to kind of see how he tries to segue us out of this war. But at this point, there is a huge public lack of support for the Vietnam War, and it becomes very unpopular. And so what we're going to look at more in the live is going to be really the whole cottage industry that came up around protests of Vietnam.